It was early evening in the heart of the city, and the streets buzzed with the sounds of life winding down for the day. Michelle, a black woman in her early 40s, was making her way home after a demanding day at work. Dressed in a sharp navy business suit, she carried a leather bag over her shoulder and clutched a takeout coffee in her hand. Her stride was purposeful, her expression calm but focused. Walking a few steps behind her was John, a white man in his early 30s, wearing a tattered hoodie and sneakers that had seen better days. He had been trailing her for several blocks, observing her movements with a predatory precision. In his mind, Michelle represented the perfect mark. A lone woman, seemingly distracted, and presumably well off, judging by her attire and confident demeanor. As they both turned into a quieter side street, John decided to make his move. Quickening his pace, he closed the gap between them. The sound of his rushed footsteps made Michelle glance briefly over her shoulder, her sharp eyes catching sight of his shadow approaching too closely. Her instincts kicked in, and she tensed but kept walking, her heart rate steady, her mind already assessing the situation. Without warning, John lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her to a halt. "Give me your bag," he barked, his voice rough and threatening. His grip tightened, and his other hand gestured toward the strap of her bag. Michelle's initial response wasn't fear, it was sharp, calculating awareness. She looked him in the eye, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Let go," she said firmly, her voice steady but commanding. Her tone wasn't what John expected. It lacked the panic or submission he was used to hearing when intimidating someone. Instead, it was laced with quiet authority. Irritated by her defiance, he raised his voice and yanked harder. "I said, give it here." But Michelle didn't budge. She let her bag slip slightly off her shoulder, not as a sign of surrender, but as preparation. When John attempted to snatch it, she made her move. With a sharp twist of her arm, she broke free of his grip and took a step back, her stance shifting into one of poised readiness. "What the?" John stammered, taken aback by her sudden defiance. Before he could react, Michelle struck. A swift jab to his solar plexus knocked the wind out of him, sending him stumbling backward. He doubled over, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. "Wrong woman," she said coldly, her voice steady and unyielding. John tried to recover, his face twisting in anger and humiliation. He lunged toward her again, his movements clumsy and desperate. But Michelle was prepared. With precision and speed, she sidestepped his charge, using his own momentum to send him sprawling onto the pavement. This unexpected resistance left John shocked and disoriented. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of pain, confusion, and disbelief. People passing by began to stop, curious about the commotion. Some started filming the scene on their phones, capturing the aftermath of John's botched robbery attempt. Michelle stood her ground, her posture calm but alert, her eyes locked on John in case he tried to get up again. Around her, murmurs began to rise as the small crowd grew. "What's going on here?" someone asked. "She's defending herself," another replied. John, still on the ground, glared up at Michelle. "You'll regret this," he spat, though his voice was weak and trembling. Michelle didn't respond. She simply adjusted her bag and stood tall, waiting for the authorities to arrive. She had no intention of letting him walk away from this unscathed. Justice would be served. John lay on the pavement, winded and humiliated. He hadn't anticipated this outcome. In his mind, this was supposed to be an easy robbery, a quick grab and go. Instead, he found himself sprawled out on the cold, uneven concrete, clutching his aching side and trying to process how everything had gone so wrong. Michelle stood above him, her breathing steady, her posture commanding. She wasn't the vulnerable target he had expected. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather. People were murmuring, some with their phones raised, recording the scene. The atmosphere was charged, a blend of curiosity and tension. John, fueled by anger and the sting of embarrassment, scrambled to his feet. His movements were jerky, his face twisted with rage. He lunged at her again, this time with more desperation than strategy. But Michelle was ready. She sidestepped his attack with ease, her movements fluid and controlled. As he stumbled past her, she extended her arm, catching him by the collar of his hoodie. With a calculated pivot, she swung him off balance, sending him crashing back to the ground. "You don't learn, do you?" she said sharply, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. This time, John didn't get up immediately. He groaned, clutching his shoulder, and glared at her with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "She took him down like it was nothing," one woman said, her tone a mix of shock and admiration. "Serves him right," a man muttered. "Thought he could just attack her and walk away." Several bystanders continued filming, their cameras capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. Someone had already dialed 911, and the faint sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the evening air. John tried once more to push himself up, but his movements were sluggish. He looked around, realizing the growing audience was witnessing his humiliation. His face burned with shame. "You're gonna regret this," he growled, his voice trembling. "You think you're tough because you got lucky?" Michelle let out a dry laugh, her gaze unwavering. "Lucky? No, honey, this isn't luck. This is preparation." Her words landed like a verbal slap, and the crowd murmured in agreement. When the police finally arrived, 2 officers stepped out of their cruiser, their expressions neutral as they surveyed the scene. One was a middle-aged white man with a stern demeanor, the other a younger black woman who seemed more curious than tense. The white officer immediately approached Michelle, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, his tone brisk. "We need to assess the situation." Michelle raised an eyebrow but complied, taking a step away from John, who was still slumped on the ground. "He tried to rob me," she said evenly, her voice clear but controlled. "And when I defended myself, this is where we ended up." The officer's eyes flicked to John, who was still groaning on the pavement. "Is that true?" he asked, though his tone lacked the skepticism he had shown toward Michelle. John didn't answer immediately, instead glaring at Michelle. Finally, he muttered, "She attacked me for no reason." Michelle folded her arms, her expression unimpressed. "Really? That's the story you're going with? Lucky for me, there are plenty of witnesses, and cameras." She gestured toward the crowd, where several people were still recording. The younger officer stepped forward, addressing the bystanders. "Did anyone see what happened?" A chorus of voices erupted, each recounting the same story. John had been the aggressor, lunging at Michelle and trying to take her bag. Several people showed their recordings to the officers, further cementing her account of events. The older officer sighed, turning to John. "All right, buddy. Stand up. Slowly. You're under arrest for attempted robbery." John's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't resist as the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs and secured his wrists. As John was escorted to the police car, the younger officer approached Michelle. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer now that the immediate tension had passed. "I'm fine," Michelle replied. "Just tired of people thinking they can prey on the easy targets." The officer nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well. Not everyone would have been able to stay so calm under pressure." Michelle offered a faint smile. "Calm is what keeps you alive sometimes." As the officers drove off with John in custody, Michelle gathered her things and prepared to leave. Several people in the crowd approached her, offering words of support and admiration. "You're amazing," one woman said. "The way you stood your ground, it was inspiring." "Thank you," Michelle replied, her voice genuine but measured. "But it shouldn't have to be like this. We all deserve to feel safe, no matter where we are." Her words resonated with the crowd, and as she walked away, the tension in the air began to dissipate. However, the impact of what had just happened lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Michelle's strength and composure had turned a moment of danger into a powerful example of resilience and justice. The next morning, Michelle sat in her apartment, sipping her coffee while scrolling through her phone. Videos of the incident had already gone viral, shared across multiple platforms with captions like, "When the tables turn," and "Don't mess with her." The comments were filled with admiration for her courage, but many also expressed anger about the broader issues the video highlighted. One comment in particular caught Michelle's attention. How many other women couldn't fight back like she did? How many didn't have a crowd to protect them? The words weighed heavily on her. The fight wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who faced similar situations daily, without the skills, confidence, or support to defend themselves. It wasn't enough that she had stood her ground. She needed to do something to make a broader impact. Michelle decided to act. As a practicing attorney and martial arts instructor, she knew she had the tools to make a difference. That same day, she contacted the director of the local community center to propose a series of free self-defense workshops for women and marginalized groups. The director, inspired by Michelle's story, immediately agreed. Meanwhile, news outlets began picking up the story. Michelle received calls from journalists eager to interview her about the incident. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition. Her actions were simply a natural response to a threat. But after some thought, she realized the interviews could be an opportunity to bring attention to systemic issues, not just the dangers women faced, but the racial and gender biases that often determined how those dangers were perceived and addressed. In one televised interview, the host asked, "Michelle, what was going through your mind when he attacked you? Were you scared?" Michelle smiled faintly, her expression calm but resolute. "Of course, I was aware of the danger, but fear doesn't have to control you. I've spent years teaching women that they're stronger than they think, not just physically, but mentally. What struck me most wasn't just his aggression, it was his assumption. He thought I'd be too scared, too weak to fight back. That assumption is rooted in the way society sees women, especially Black women, as easy targets." Her words resonated deeply. The clip of her interview was shared widely, sparking discussions about the intersection of gender, race, and personal safety. A few weeks later, Michelle was called to testify in court. John faced charges of attempted robbery and assault, though his defense attorney tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding. The overwhelming evidence from witness testimony and video footage left little room for doubt. Michelle delivered her testimony with the same calm confidence she had shown during the incident. "He didn't see a person when he attacked me," she said, addressing the courtroom. "He saw an opportunity. He saw someone he thought wouldn't fight back. That's the problem. Too often, people like me are seen as less deserving of safety, less deserving of respect. That needs to change." The judge, visibly moved by her words, handed down a firm sentence: several years of imprisonment for John, along with mandatory counseling. Justice had been served, but Michelle knew her work was far from over. Michelle's self-defense workshops quickly gained traction. The first session was packed with women of all ages and backgrounds, some eager to learn new skills, others seeking a sense of empowerment after experiencing their own traumas. Michelle began each class not with physical training, but with a conversation. "You don't have to be a fighter to defend yourself," she told the group. "You just have to believe that your safety, your dignity, your life are worth protecting. And trust me, they are." Her workshops grew into a larger movement. With the help of local organizations, Michelle expanded the program, offering resources for survivors of assault and advocating for changes in local policies to improve public safety. Her story inspired other communities to start similar initiatives, creating a ripple effect of empowerment and awareness. Months later, Michelle was walking through the same city streets where the attack had occurred. She noticed how people now recognized her, some nodding in respect, others stopping to thank her for the impact she had made. One day, a young woman approached her. "Hi, Michelle," she said nervously. "I took your self-defense class last month. I just wanted to say thank you. I never thought I could stand up for myself, but because of you, I feel like I can." Michelle smiled warmly. "That's exactly why I do this," she said. "The strength was always in you. You just needed someone to remind you. Michelle's journey became more than a story of self-defense. It became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up against injustice. Through her actions, she reminded everyone that even in moments of vulnerability, there is strength. And through her work, she ensured that strength would be passed on to others, creating a legacy of empowerment and hope. As John sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his cuffed wrists resting on the table in front of him. His lawyer whispered hurried instructions, but John's mind was elsewhere. The days following his arrest had been a whirlwind of humiliation and regret. His face was now recognizable across the city, his name tarnished by the viral videos of his failed robbery attempt. What stung the most, however, was the realization that he had underestimated not just Michelle, but the resilience of the very people he had preyed upon. The courtroom was packed, with Michelle seated near the front, flanked by her attorney and a group of supporters. The air was heavy with anticipation as the judge entered and the trial began. Michelle's testimony was the highlight of the proceedings. She described the events of that evening with clarity and composure, but her words went beyond recounting the attack. She addressed the deeper implications of what had occurred. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "this wasn't just about a man trying to take my belongings. It was about someone who assumed that I would be too afraid, too powerless to stop him. That assumption is part of a broader problem, a society that underestimates people like me, that makes women feel unsafe simply for walking home. This case isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens to so many others who don't have the chance to fight back." Her words echoed in the silent courtroom. Even John seemed taken aback, his head lowering slightly as she spoke. When the time came for the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge, a gray-haired woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, addressed the courtroom. "John Miller," she began, her gaze fixed on him, "your actions on the night in question were not only illegal, but indicative of a deeper disregard for the safety and dignity of others. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your attempt to shift blame only underscores your lack of accountability." John's lawyer tried to interject with a plea for leniency, but the judge held up her hand. "I've made my decision," she said firmly. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison, with mandatory counseling and rehabilitation. I hope that during this time, you reflect on your actions and the impact they've had, not just on your victim, but on your community." As the sentence was announced, a collective murmur spread through the courtroom. Michelle remained composed, though there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Justice had been served, but for her, this was only part of the battle. In the weeks that followed his sentencing, John began his time in a state correctional facility. At first, he was defiant, refusing to engage in the mandated counseling sessions. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of his choices began to settle on him. During one session, his counselor, a no-nonsense older man named Mr. Davis, confronted him directly. "Why did you target her?" Mr. Davis asked, his tone calm but probing. John hesitated, then muttered, "I don't know. She looked like she had money, like she wouldn't fight back." Mr. Davis leaned forward. "And why did you think that? What made you assume she wouldn't resist?" John had no answer. The silence stretched between them until Mr. Davis finally said, "It's because you didn't see her as a person. You saw her as an opportunity. That mindset, dehumanizing others, is what got you here. If you ever want to change, you need to start seeing people for who they really are." John didn't respond, but Mr. Davis's words lingered. Over time, the sessions forced John to confront not only his actions, but the biases and assumptions that had shaped his decisions. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to change. While John grappled with his reckoning, Michelle continued to build her movement. Her workshops expanded beyond self-defense, incorporating discussions about systemic inequality, personal empowerment, and community safety. She partnered with local organizations to create safe spaces for women to share their experiences and support one another. The impact of her work reached beyond her city. She was invited to speak at conferences and community events where she shared her story and the lessons it had taught her. "Strength isn't just about physical power," she told an audience at a women's empowerment summit. "It's about knowing your worth, standing up for yourself, and refusing to let fear control you. But it's also about building a society where people don't have to fight for their safety in the first place." Her words resonated deeply, and her message became a rallying cry for change. A surprising letter. One day, months after the trial, Michelle received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address revealed its origin: a correctional facility. Opening it cautiously, she unfolded the letter and began to read. "Dear Michelle, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I did to you and for what I've done to others. I've spent the past few months thinking about that night and what it says about me as a person. You didn't just fight back physically, you made me see myself for what I really am. I hope you know that your strength changed more than just the outcome of that night. It's changing me too. Sincerely, John Miller." Michelle stared at the letter for a long moment, her emotions conflicted. She didn't feel pity for John, nor did she absolve him of responsibility, but there was a small measure of satisfaction in knowing that her actions had made an impact, even on someone like him. The letter was a reminder that change could start in the most unexpected places. For Michelle, it reinforced her belief that resilience and justice weren't just personal victories, they were seeds of transformation, capable of reaching even the most unlikely individuals. As she continued her work, she carried that belief with her, determined to build a world where strength, dignity, and justice were rights, not privileges. Months had passed since the night of the attack, and what had begun as a single act of self-defense had blossomed into a citywide movement for empowerment and justice. Michelle's self-defense workshops were now at capacity, with participants spilling into waiting lists. Women from all walks of life came, sharing stories of vulnerability, fear, and, increasingly, hope. One evening, Michelle stood at the front of the room in her now-packed community center, gazing at the group of eager faces before her. Young women, elderly grandmothers, single mothers, and even teenage girls filled the seats. Many had been inspired by her story, seeing in her not just a fighter, but a symbol of resilience and dignity. She began the session the way she always did, with a reminder of their inherent strength. "Every single one of you is powerful," she said, her voice carrying over the room. "Not because of your fists or your kicks, but because of your worth. You have a right to your safety, to your dignity, and to your peace of mind. That's what we're protecting here, not just our bodies, but our belief in ourselves." The room erupted in applause, and Michelle felt a swell of pride. But it wasn't just about the applause. It was about the shift she could feel in the room, the collective energy of women reclaiming their power. The workshops didn't just teach physical self-defense. Michelle partnered with local advocacy groups to offer resources for survivors of assault, legal aid for those facing harassment, and even counseling services for women who had been silenced for too long. The initiative began to take on a life of its own, growing into something far larger than Michelle had imagined. One participant, a young single mother named Carla, approached Michelle after a session. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she shared her story. "I used to walk around scared all the time," Carla admitted. "Scared for myself, scared for my little girl. But after these classes, I don't feel that way anymore. You gave me my courage back." Michelle placed a reassuring hand on Carla's shoulder. "You always had it, Carla. I just helped you see it." Stories like Carla's became common, each one reinforcing Michelle's determination to keep pushing forward. As the movement grew, it began attracting the attention of local politicians and community leaders. Michelle was invited to speak at city council meetings, where she pushed for stronger public safety measures, better lighting in underserved neighborhoods, and funding for self-defense and empowerment programs. At one such meeting, Michelle delivered a passionate speech. "Safety isn't a privilege," she declared to the room of council members. "It's a right. But for too many women, especially Black women, that right is compromised every day. We're forced to live with the constant burden of vigilance, to take precautions that others don't have to think about. It's time for this city to stand with us, to create spaces where we don't have to fight just to feel safe. Her words struck a chord, and within weeks, the City Council voted to approve several of her proposed measures. Funding was allocated to install brighter streetlights in high-crime areas, and her workshops received city sponsorship to expand their reach. National media outlets soon caught wind of Michelle's work. Her story was featured in major publications and on television programs, where she spoke candidly about her experience and the larger issues it represented. On one widely watched morning show, the host asked, "Michelle, you've become a symbol of empowerment for so many people. What drives you to keep going?" Michelle smiled thoughtfully before responding. "What happened to me wasn't unique. Women, especially women of color, face these threats every day. What drives me is knowing that we can change that, not overnight and not alone, but step by step. Every workshop, every conversation, every policy we change, that's progress. That's how we build a safer world." The interview went viral, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. Other women began organizing their own self-defense classes and community programs, citing Michelle as their inspiration. One evening, Michelle was closing up the community center after a long day of workshops when she noticed a familiar face at the door. It was Officer Johnson, the Black woman police officer who had responded to the scene of the attack months ago. She looked different now, less formal, more at ease, as she approached Michelle with a warm smile. "I just wanted to thank you," Officer Johnson said. "What you're doing here, it's incredible. I see the difference it's making every day." Michelle tilted her head curiously. "How so?" "Women I've encountered in my work, they're more confident, more willing to stand up for themselves. They talk about your classes, your speeches. You've given them something they didn't have before." Michelle felt a wave of gratitude. "I'm just trying to do my part," she said. "You're doing more than that," Johnson replied. "You're changing lives." Weeks later, Michelle received another letter. This time, it wasn't from John, but from a young woman named Taylor in a neighboring state. Taylor wrote about how she had been attacked late one night, but managed to fight off her attacker using techniques she had learned from watching Michelle's workshops online. "You don't know me, but you saved me," the letter read. "Because of you, I knew I could fight back. Thank you for giving me the strength to believe in myself." Michelle sat with the letter for a long time, tears welling in her eyes. It was a poignant reminder of why she had started this journey and of the lives she was impacting far beyond her own community. Michelle's work continued to grow, becoming a beacon of hope for women everywhere. What began as a single act of self-defense had transformed into a movement that empowered countless individuals to reclaim their strength and demand justice. Her name became synonymous with resilience, her story a testament to the power of standing up in the face of adversity. But for Michelle, the greatest victory wasn't in the recognition or the accolades. It was in the lives changed, the fears replaced with confidence, and the knowledge that no one had to walk through the world feeling powerless ever again. And so, as she stood before yet another room full of women, ready to teach them not just how to defend themselves, but how to believe in their own strength, she smiled and said the words that had come to define her journey: "You are stronger than you know, and the world will see it too."